Okay, so yeah, I'm Peter Coppin, and I run a lab called the Perceptual Artifacts Lab, also called the Accessible Graphics Initiative, and I teach in a graduate program called Inclusive Design, and there's actually a lot of inclusive design students here right now because we're running our Summer 2 Intensive, which is a 2-week class, and we've sort of combined it with this particular morning because the topic is relevant to both areas. And after I speak, there will be several other presentations from trainees in the program and who are my advisees and working in different aspects of this research area. So what I'm going to be doing is sort of laying out the program and the theoretical background, okay? And then so I'm like the table of contents, and then they're going to go into detail about different aspects that we've tackled over the past year. So I'm going to start off by giving an example of the problem we're trying to tackle in this area of data analytics, which is overwhelmingly dominated by visual representations. So I'm going to show an example of what would be considered an accessible information graphic using what are called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines.
The graph of the IBM stock price and volume indicates that the stock price rose to a peak of $120 in early June, fell to a low of $105 in early July, rose to the maximum price of $133 in September, and fell to the...
So that goes for a while. So what was on the screen there, okay, that you could only perceive if you were looking visually, is a lot of information other than what you had in that text description. So on the screen right now, you'll see that financial chart split out into 3 sort of areas. So one, we could think of them as the labels for the various parts of the chart. And so that's pretty easy to represent through text-to-speech, okay, because it's a writing system, okay? Now, but the shape information, this mountain with rising and falling contour is not communicated, and what we get instead is a text-based interpretation of what that shape is, okay? And so, as I'll mention later, people have been trying to figure out the difference between what writing is versus a picture since ancient times, okay? And we have a provisional model that we use for these problems, okay? But probably that text description isn't what the author of that graphic intended, okay? There's something about the visual shape that's important, and this is most often not being communicated when we convert this into a non-visual perceptual mode, okay? Sensory mode, okay? So there's lots of ways of talking about this problem, but it ties into something called the graphic linguistic distinction, okay? Like trying to understand what are the fundamental properties and affordances of a visual graphic versus something that would maybe be written, okay? And how does that correspond to similar correspondences in sound and touch, okay? So prior to doing a lot of this work, my focus was on trying to understand the affordances of visual graphics, okay? And I developed this perceptual cognitive model for use in inclusive design, but mainly focused on visual perception because there's a huge number of issues dealing with visuals, okay? Such as dyslexia, things like that, okay? Now, what the model does, and I'll go into it in more detail later, but just to give you at the high level, it developed a way to describe pictures in terms of how relations among objects and objects are pictorially represented, which I characterize as the light that's reflecting from the graphic, okay? All right, and then diagrams or hybrid graphics as relations among objects that are pictured and objects that are symbolized, and sentences as symbolized relations among symbolized objects, okay? All right, now in the next slide, we have a multisensory version of that, okay? So on the left, you have 3 representations that are labeled. And one is basically a picture of like a mountain shape, okay? A line that's in a mountain shape, okay? Below that, you have a spectral display of a sound file that has a rising and falling tone that corresponds to that shape. And so So that would be known as what's called a cross-sensory correspondence. I'll show you an example in a moment, okay? Where there's a relationship with a quote-unquote natural or easy mapping, okay? Like an easy one would be a bell. Like a bigger bell rings at a lower frequency, a small bell rings at a higher frequency, right? And so you can use that cross-sensory correspondence because people make a natural association between large objects and things that ring at low frequencies and so on and so forth, right? Okay? Now, beneath that, you have a tactile mountain, just a shape. It's a picture of a piece of metal bent into the same mountain shape, okay? And then below that, you have someone creating a gesture, okay? With their arm, they're showing the shape of a mountain, right? So all of these representations on the left of the screen are what we would call iconic representations, okay? Which comes from the field of semiotics, okay? Which is sort of the science and study and philosophy of representations, okay? Which we use a little bit of in my lab, but also a bunch of other stuff, as you'll see, okay? Now, and the idea is that an iconic representation, or the iconic properties resemble the thing they represent. So a picture of my cat resembles the cat. Whereas on the right, if we had the word cat in English, it does not resemble the cat, but it refers to it has a convention that refers to a category, cat, okay? All right, and then so for each of these representations, so for sound, okay, on the more symbolic side of the spectrum would be spoken language, okay, all right, and for the tactile world, so you could have a shape of a mountain you would feel, but then also that can be expressed through Braille, okay, or some other tactile writing system, and then with sign language. So in sign language, you have more iconic representations, like the one you see where it's tracing out the shape of the mountain. But then you also have gestures that are more symbolic in nature, okay? Now, there's nothing that's ever purely iconic and nothing that's ever purely symbolic, but I'll get to that later, okay? Now, nicely, the presentations that follow deal with different aspects of this. So Felipe Sarmiento's project, which will come right after mine, is focusing on non-visual, non-oral soccer spectatorship, and he discovered and then studied and then replicated an emergent new sign language for communicating soccer, okay? And what's relevant here is it's one of the first such systems, at least that we've found, that actually replicates the spatial and topological relationships between the player and the ball. I mean, that's like why you watch it on TV, okay? You don't want the conceptual category. You want to see you want to know where the ball is and where the players are, okay? But then there's other abstract aspects of the game, like the whistle blow and so on and so forth, okay? Then after that, we'll have Brandon Biggs and Lena Yusim, who have been working on the mapping problem, okay? And they've been doing a lot of co-design and looking at what we'll call naturalistic observations of stuff that's evolving in culture, and using that to develop conventions for cross-sensory data analytics. And then after that, Utari Godke will speak about the cross-sensory interactive tactile globe that she's developing, okay, and co-designing with end users, okay? So, okay, now, in terms of the field, there's an interesting situation because traditional heuristics from graphic design are pretty much focused on vision, and it's most often traditionally been practiced as a craft, okay? But we're in territory where this mapping between different sensory modes, it often is aided by a theoretical understanding about how vision works, how hearing works, and stuff like that, okay? Now, so there's a field of interactive information visualization, and but then also another community called the International Conference on Auditory Display. Okay, now these are communities that are not often in communication because they're divided up by perceptual modes. Okay, then you have fields that look across how bodies process information, like the field of cognitive science, but these are not often connected with these applied areas. There are a few overlaps. Okay. Like our colleague at Brian Fisher, I see him at the CogSci conference, I see him at InfoVis, okay? But there's this big divide in the fields, and so a lot of what we're doing is, in addition to creating our own investigations, is theoretical work to see where these correspondences that have been sort of uncovered deeply in these different fields actually map together, okay? Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some of the core theoretical ideas, okay? So on the picture there, you have just a snapshot of a food menu in Toronto's Chinatown, okay? All right? And for each food menu item, you have a picture of the food that it represents, okay? And then you have a written graphic beside it. And there's an interesting property of this, that for every cultural linguistic group that makes use of the menu, it's written in the writing system of that cultural linguistic group. Okay, so you got Chinese writing, you've got English, okay? You might have French. The closer you get to Koreatown, you might have another writing system, okay? And so there's an intuition that there's something about pictures that seem to cut across cultures, okay? Although that's not completely the case, but in this example it does. And there's something about something that's written where it's more culturally specific, okay? Now, this is a huge debate that goes way back, okay? But let me refer to some more intuitions this time, and then I'm going to sort of talk about a way of navigating this, okay? So there's a practitioner, Scott McCloud, who wrote a book, Understanding Comics, that's so popular you can buy it at the local bookstore. It's a comic book about comics, okay? Well, it's auto-advancing on its own. I don't know why it's doing that, okay? That's weird, okay. All right, that was strange. It was like a ghost hand. Okay, anyway, all right. So on the picture there, you have a realistic picture of an apple, okay? And on the right, you have the word Apple Inc., okay? And then from left to right, you have these different pictures of apples that are getting more simplified, more like an outline drawing, more like a caricature, then more like the Apple symbol, okay, like from Apple Computer Company, and then the word Apple. So when he developed his sort of taxonomy of representation, you could think of it like a proto-theory to use in practice, okay? In his understanding, these types of representations fall on a continuum, and he referred to as the pictures, the more pictorial ones as more received, and then the more symbolic ones as more perceived. This idea that one is easier, requires less learning, and one that requires more work, more effort, okay? All right, now there's a big debate, one of many, many debates that goes back to ancient times, but one that's relevant here between two major theorists, and one was a scientist. So there was, we'll call one the ecological account, and it was this idea that picture perception is quote unquote innate biologically grounded capability, okay? So J.J. Gibson, major theorist, if you ever hear the word affordance in design, that was adapted from his idea of ecological psychology, okay? At the same time, you had analytic philosopher Nelson Goodman, who had a competing argument that pictures are conventions, and that they're arbitrary, okay? So for example, when we think of linear perspective, that could easily have evolved a different way, like inverse perspective, and it would just seem as realistic as the perspective that we're used to, okay? And they never resolved their disagreement, but it reflects a big debate that really goes back a long time. Now, there's some intuitions I'm going to refer to here before I get to a way to navigate this, okay? So when we think of the graphical user interface on your computer, like with a desktop, it's auto-advancing again, don't know why, okay? So, so there's something about it, at least the marketers talk about how intuitive and natural the interface is, right? And this is in contrast to a command line interface like DOS, which most of you guys probably don't remember, but Unix is still active today, okay, where you have to type every command. There's this idea that one is easier or quicker to learn, okay? What the convention does is the pictures seem to replicate properties you get for free in the world, okay? So when I put a folder in a folder, okay, on my computer, that's what happens in the physical world. If I take a file and put it in the trash can, that's that is what happens in the physical world, right? Okay? Now, people have tried to build on this intuition to create visual programming languages without much success. And there's several empirical studies on these. There's some limited cases where it's been successful. But in terms of a mainstream programming language, no one has successfully developed a visual programming language yet. The artifact evolution of conventions seems to go towards something that requires a writing text-based, okay? All right? Okay, so then there's other notations. So for example, in mathematical reasoning, okay, pictures are often used to come up with a theoretical proof, but the actual proof in practice needs to be written, okay? There's actually a whole conference focused on this problem, okay? So, and in the next slide, I just have some thinkers going back to Aristotle who've had a similar type of debate, okay? Now, so before I get to the way of looking at it, I want to talk to one debate that's relevant because a lot of the work we're doing in cognitive science, okay, and actually this conference relates to that field. And so if you look at the history of this problem, I'm not going to go all the way back, but there was this thing called the cognitive revolution, okay, and it sort of emerged with computation, okay, and it was this idea that brains are sort of like computers, okay, and it allowed a series of questions that hadn't really been allowed in psychology for a long time, okay. And this was a question about what is the nature of internal representation in the mind, okay? And there were two competing views that correspond to this, debate I referred to before, okay? And so one is that we have mental imagery, okay? This was Stephen Coslin, this was his view, but lots of people followed it. And then the competing view was called the propositional view, that mental representations are language-like, they're propositions, okay? And this was a big debate that raged and lots of experiments going back and forth. Probably one of the most famous was a mental rotation experiment. So they show you a shape, okay, in one picture, and then they show you the shape again, but rotated, and they time the amount of time it takes to mentally rotate that, okay? And so they use that to argue that, well, there must be some kind of mental imagery, okay, or internal representation that has these spatial properties because it takes longer to rotate it further, okay? And there are other experiments like go down to the boat, now go down into the lower chamber, go into the closet, take something out of a box, right, okay? And so that would take longer. The further you had to go down into the boat or building or whatever, the longer it took. But the competing argument back was, well, if this were like a propositional structure, okay, with hierarchically linked lists, the deeper you go into the structure, the longer it would take. So you really haven't convinced us, okay? So the invention of fMRI came about, which is, we've probably all seen the pictures, know a little bit about it, but the basic idea is you put someone's head in a big sensitive magnet. When blood flows to parts of the brain where you're quote unquote doing mental work, then you can detect it, right? Okay? And so a series of experiments were run, okay? And what they found is that you're using the same sort of perceptual cognitive machinery, okay, for quote unquote mental imagery as is being used in perception, right? So if I perceive an Air Canada jet flying from my left to my right, and then if I close my eyes and imagine it, okay, and you can actually try this. It's like your eyes track with it, okay? So, and in these fMRI scans, it showed that a lot of the same perceptual cognitive machinery was being used, okay? So this guy named Barcelou developed a theory called perceptual symbol systems, okay? And I will give a simplified version of it now, but in a way that isn't controversial because not everyone agrees with his views. Auto-advancing again, don't know why. Okay, all right. So we don't really need the slides. So I've got this object in front of me, and light is reflecting from it, and also there's vibrations that are creating air pressure, and I'm detecting it with my eardrums, okay? all right? So you could say that light is reflecting, or the air pressure, there's sensation from the object, okay? Information pickup, okay? All right, now, but to actually grab the cup, okay, or do anything with it, my brain is filling in stuff. And so you could call this internal stimulation or internal representation. So when my hand curves around to the far side of the cup, okay, even though I'm not directly perceiving it, my body has knowledge of the shape, okay, that it connects with what I'm visually perceiving. And so we'll call that stimulation or internal representation, okay? Now, these are constructed from memories of past experiences. If you look at a baby developing, they're like grabbing objects or shoving them in their mouth, which is actually really sensitive. And so the idea is that they're building up like an internal model or simulation of objects, right? Okay. So this is sort of the leading view is this is sort of a fundamental property of perception, that fundamentally you're picking up information, but you're also simulating or filling in. And so experience and memory performs a big role in this, okay? All right? Okay, so there's a way of thinking about, and this is called the perception action cycle, but basically, just to summarize, since it's auto-advancing for me anyway, okay? If you take that little cycle and you stretch it out over time, you've got this wavy line waving back and forth. The higher it goes, the more we're talking about an abstract simulation in the mind, and the lower it is, the more we're talking about a concrete situation in the world, okay? So what Barcelou was able to do was resolve this debate by pointing out that when you think of internal representation or mental simulation, this reuse of machinery during imagination, okay, that you use during perception, there's simulators that are more closely coupled with the sensory surface, okay? And these simulations are more, well, I'll just use a word from earlier, they're more iconic-like, okay? They resemble the thing they represent. So if I'm imagining my grandmother, it's like a mental simulation, okay, and it's replicating the type of structure that I would perceive, okay? Or if I'm imagining the door slamming, same thing, okay? But then there are more abstract simulators, okay, that develop over a lifespan, okay? And that would be we could think of that as the category that the simulation falls under, okay? And Barcelou and Pilishin, who was part of this debate, they develop a way that we've adapted to distinguish something concrete from abstract, because that's another huge philosophical problem, okay? So you could think of something as concrete if it replicates the type of structure you could perceive in the world. Okay, all right? So if I have a drawing of this chair, you could think that as a representation of something that's concrete because you could perceive that in the world, okay? Whereas an abstract concept like love or infinity, okay, or a number, okay, these are abstract categories that many concrete structures can fall under, and so that needs to be represented through a convention because you can't directly perceive it in the world. And so if you look at what is afforded or what is conveyed through a representation, okay, in this body of work, the prediction, okay, is that if the attempt is to communicate an abstract concept, okay, that it is probably more effective to use a writing system, okay, and if your intention is to communicate an abstract category, probably better off with pictures. Now, the important thing here is that these pictorial and symbolic properties are part of all representations, right? So if you're like in a Renaissance chapel in Rome and you see a picture of a bird flying skyward, okay? So you know, you're perceiving optical structure, okay? So it is of a concrete object, but it's the category of a bird, and it probably has like a religious significance, right? So there's never something that's purely pictorial, okay? Whereas if I write the word cat, okay, or write the word bird, well, there is still a light structure reflecting from the page, and if I say it, there's still sound pressure, right? Okay, and there's even iconic properties in words. And in fact, in a week, there's a conference here in International Association for Cognitive Semiotics, and one of the big topics is about sound symbolism. Okay, and so that is where you have aspects of language that resemble the thing they represent, and it often emerges in multiple cultures. So it's like my research assistant Ambrose Lee, he speaks Chinese, and the Chinese word for cat, which I forgot, but it sounds a lot, to my Western ears, a lot like meow. Does anyone here speak Chinese by chance? Meow, okay. So that would be an example of sound symbolism, and that is iconicity that is embedded in a symbolic representation, right? Okay? Okay, so, both Gibson, who had the ecological account, and Goodman, who had this constructivist account, there's a way of thinking that they both had useful ideas, only it's this idea that pictures seem more natural or you get them for free. You can understand that because these are lower level simulators you develop by perceiving and acting in the world, okay? So I grew up in a world with occluded surfaces and edges, okay? And so if someone creates a picture that replicates those optical structures and they speak a different language, I will probably still be able to make use of the picture as long as it produces the structures that I would be able to perceive in the world, okay? All right? Whereas the more abstract concept would be more culturally specific, okay? Now, it doesn't mean that the pictures mean the same thing in each culture, but it means that there's some property that you can probably make use of, right? And this is what seems to be afforded by a lot of visualizations, okay? So it is this pictorial property or this iconic property that is not being replicated when we use only a text description, okay? And so what we need to do is find the cross-sensory correspondence, okay? And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about that, okay? So, and because I think I only have 5 minutes, right, Irina? Or I started a little bit late. How much time do I have? I don't know where she is. Anyway, okay. So I'm going to jump to, okay. So just to go back to the cross, say again? Okay, yeah. So on the picture here, we have this continuum again. So I have a photo. Yeah, okay, all right. Okay, yeah. So you've got, and you've got the written word car on the right, and then you have something that seems in between, like this type of thing you would use in a desktop icon, right? Now, so actually you use these every day on your computer. So when you throw something in a trash can on a Mac and you hear that swooshing sound, okay, that is what is called an ear con, okay, in the auditory display world. And so this is an example of an ear con from one of our sonifications, and that represents troops moving, okay? So you could think of that as, it's not as rich as a sonic version of a picture, and it's not completely symbolic or highly symbolic like the word troops are marching. It has some property that's somewhere in between, okay? All right, and here's an ear con that represents a city that someone's going to, but you'd have to actually have to see the sonification to sort of get that.
Right
okay?
button is pressed.
All right, now let's talk about some sonifications and some unique methods we're using. So
Right button is
right now
pressed.
I'm showing an early
Panning to the
prototype.
right.
Okay, this is an example of the height-frequency cross-sensory correspondence. Okay, so
Left button
what you
is
basically
pressed.
have is an
Panning to
outline
the
drawing
left.
of a mountain on
Right
the screen.
button.
And the higher the elevation, the higher the sound frequency. So if you were to scrub back and forth, you're able to perceive this shape without vision, right? Now, that works for simple things, but on this slide, we have what's called Napoleon's March, which is one of the most famous information visualizations, probably, at least in the visualization world, okay? And it's remarkable for representing 6 types of data in 2 dimensions, but I'm not going to go into detail about it right now, but just to say that this one is not as obvious how you would sonify it, because through that convention, if you're scrubbing back and forth, you would get multiple signals simultaneously. So imagine a line passing down through that graphic. So you've got the troops leaving the city of origin and going to Moscow, and then they march back, and the thickness of the line corresponds to the number of troops. And so as you can see, it's getting thinner and thinner and when you get back, it's just like a hairline next to the big band, right? Now, so to sonify that, what we did is we used immersive binaural audio. I don't think I have time to show the demo, but I didn't mean to anyway, so that's okay. All right, but the idea is that, oh, okay, all right. So I'll show the demo. Okay. All right. I don't know if there's stereo on this. Can you guys hear that? Jalen, can you help me? So when you're wearing headphones, okay, what happens is when you hear it out of your left ear, actually my eye saccade to the left, okay, I actually track with it, and so the idea is that the sonic version of that information graphic is standing in a plane and being immersed in audio, okay, and so what you basically hear the troops marching around you, and as the troop numbers drop off, the sound, there's fewer footsteps, okay? And then when you get to snow, like to cold weather, you hear crunching snow and things like that, okay? That's the return trip. The sound isn't so great, but I'll send Arena the file and you can listen to it through headphones, okay? I want to talk about one last thing in terms of methods, okay? Now, it's one thing to have a theory of what might be effective, but actually design goes to places where we don't have a scientific understanding, okay? So one of the things that we've been doing, and you will see this in all the presentations from the research group that follow, is we engage in what's called co-design, so that's working with end users, okay, who might potentially use the thing you're designing. But more importantly, we look for what we call natural laboratories, okay? Places where things are being naturally selected in culture, okay? So without going into a lot of detail, okay, artifacts co-evolve with humans. So languages evolve, okay? Sign languages evolve, okay? So in one study, studied 3 cohorts of students in a school in Nicaragua where sign language was not taught, okay? But by the end of three cohorts of students, an actual sign language had naturally emerged, okay? And they were able to observe the trajectory of its evolution, okay? Going from highly iconic representations that resemble the things they represented to over 3 cohorts, certain highly symbolic representations that communicate abstract categories emerge, okay? So we use this technique a lot, okay? So maps have evolved in culture for a very long period of time, okay? It doesn't mean this is not the same thing as a scientific test of your study. That's something else. This is the inductive phase to get ideas about what might be effective, okay? And so when Felipe talks, he'll be talking about how he used an actual field work to inform a design, which he then prototyped and developed. When Brandon and Lena talk, they'll be talking about a study from the audio gaming world, okay, where a sort of language of mapping has emerged that has actually not been reported in the auditory display world, okay, but because these things have been evolving for multiple generations of consumers at this point, there are ideas that actually we can implement for mapping, okay. Another natural laboratory, which Utara will talk about, is working with one of our colleagues who actually built his own globe. He happens to be blind. He built his own globe, okay, and it has some unique properties, okay, that we're trying to replicate through a prototype. So I think I'll just end there and take questions. Yeah. All right.
I'll just talk real loud. Two? Two?
Oh.
Hello?
You want to?
No, no. So, hey, Peter.
Hey.
So is there some that just like have, I don't want to say obvious, direct cultural correlations to the way that you use particular things? Because I noticed that, like, with the sound dynamic in particular, the auditory, you used like high pitch for high altitude, low pitch for low altitude. And then I was thinking about how that correlates to other things like size or speed, and like usually there's like rapid high tones for little tiny mouse feet, or like, you know, and like big booming sounds for larger things. But is there just, do you take that into consideration, or is it just kind of a known thing,
No, I
or is
think
it kind of just an assumption?
I think you'd always have to take it into consideration. I mean, these things aren't universal. There's just some patterns that seem to cut across, and some that don't, right? And I think, I mean, there's lots of theories about it, but the practical one is mappings that you get from being in the world, okay? But even with visual perception, people who grow up in cities perceive objects and relations differently than people who grow up in the country, okay? So these conventions are useful for determining what might be effective, but then we have to do in-depth studies and actually evaluate the interfaces, okay, to see if they might be effective, right? But I think we can never really make too many assumptions, right? Okay. I mean, another one is that you know, if someone has grown up using a screen reader, okay, they're perceiving or navigating cities using sound and touch. They're going to have a very different way of processing those sounds than someone who's using vision, okay? So yeah, one thing I want to announce, so there's this thing called the Multisensory Expo, which will be at the Ada Slate Gallery. Like, it will definitely be up on July 13th. You'll see some example prototypes, and there's a conference, International Association for Cognitive Semiotics Conference, where there'll be a few talks about some of this stuff, from people in this room. So anyway, I think I'm done.